Hello, and welcome to the podcast. This is Get in the Driver's Seat. We're telling stories about leadership moments in small to mid-sized professional practices. I'm your host, Sandra Beckor, Practice Management Coach at Beckor Management. I'm excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. Georgette Zinaty, the Executive Vice President at Corporate Class and Practice Lead for their Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Training Programs. Georgette is a 2-time TEDx Speaker. She is the founder of a nonprofit called WOO, that stands for Women Helping Empower Women. And she published a book on the scarcity of women and diversity in leadership called Why Not You? For the people watching on YouTube, here it is. And 100% of all the profits go to support her charity. Welcome, Georgette.
Thanks. Thank you for having me, Sandra. It's so nice to see you.
Yeah, you as well, every time. So Georgette and I met through our respective roles at York University's Accelerator Program for Women-Led Businesses, Y-Space Ella. And no surprise, every time we get together, it's an engaging, exciting conversation about women in leadership. And last time we stumbled on this discussion about women and permission around using their voice. And Georgette, I love that you suggested we use that for our podcast.
Well, thank you. And thanks for being open to the idea.
So instead of, asking you a bunch of questions, I thought, let's just compare notes. Both of us have so much experience in this little micro topic. And I just wanted to ask you, about your own experiences where you've run into this, barriers to using your voice, where you've seen it come up with clients, and how you've handled it. And I'll do it too. So, so we'll go back and forth.
Well, I've never been one to be shy to speak up, I will say. But what I've learned is to hone that skill a little bit better. And so I could go back in time, but I think, when I was doing my research around women and women in leadership and the scarcity of women in leadership for my doctorate, one of my aha moments, if you will, was my professor, my supervisor said, you should speak to this gentleman. He's doing a lot of work around women in leadership. And he was from industry, off Bay Street. And so I went to see him and said, I sort of started drafting a chapter. And he said, I've read your stuff. And so here's my advice if women want to succeed. Keep your mouth shut. And I was like, And so I politely took that advice and recycled it. And thought that would never tell a woman to do that and not speak up. And what I have learned over time is when to speak and how to own the room doing that. But doing that is what we talked about in terms of finding your voice, right? And when someone minimizes it, how to take back the room. And so a lot of the training that I do around our women in leadership programs is very much about knowing and owning your space. If someone takes that away from you, how do you take back the room politely? Because often women want to be liked. We all want to be like women particularly. We don't want to seem as aggressive, but sort of defining the line between aggressive and assertive. And then coaching people on that in terms of how do you do that so that you do it really well and don't come across as being this like person in a meeting. But you sort of think, okay, well, that's good. She owned that. And she did it in a very smart, strategic, and polite way. How about you?
Oh, yeah, I've got stories too. I just want to ask you if we could go a bit deeper there because it's such a great entry point to this topic. Just could you tell any kind of a story about where you did feel like the room was taken from you and you took it back?
I could write a book. Another book.
Could you?
Yeah. So, well, I can give you a couple examples and not that long ago, I will say. So one was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I was the executive director at the University of Toronto, Scarborough campus, leading the largest campaign in Canadian history. We were at, a big sort of forum, and I was presenting as a member of the senior leadership team. So the person before me was our CAO, a gentleman. He presented on the budget and kind of the vision for the campus. I then presented on our campaign. We were going, all of these things. And then we opened it up to questions. So this, I'm going to say, is you can imagine this is a large forum of alumni, donors, blah, blah, blah. And it was also live streamed. And so first question from the audience was an older white gentleman. He said, well, what are your qualifications for your position? And there was this, I could hear people gasping and murmuring. And then because this was live streamed, the chair of the, of the meeting said, did you just ask her for her CV? and so I, of course, my brain kind of went to one direction, and then I, and part of what we talk about when we talk about leadership presence, and when we do training on this, is being able to keep your composure, right? To be able to kind of be authentic, keep your composure. And I could have been like, I'm sorry, you didn't ask him that, but I didn't do that. Right. But I did, I smiled and I said, well, thank you so much for your question. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. And I opted to take 3 to 5 minutes to talk about how brilliant I was, how I walk on water, how I've changed, in every job I've been in, kind of overachieved, did all these wonderful kind of, took departments into different places. And then I smiled nicely and I said, does that answer your question? He goes, yeah, thanks. I said, oh no, thank you for asking. And then we went on to business. And what was interesting about that is, when my part was done, I kind of handed the clicker over to the vice president of the university. He went, great job. And then I went out because they went into camera. I went outside, turned on my phone, and it was just blowing up with people saying, you handled that so well. Congratulations. All these things. And I thought, it's an aha moment for me because it really made me realize how we can manage our reputation and our market value as women in terms of how we react. I could have reacted and said, you didn't ask him that. And I would have been completely right to have asked that. But I thought, if you're going to give me the floor, I'm going to use it to amplify who I am. And thank you for that gift. And it's not the first time. I mean, there was another time, even 3 years ago, again, academic institution. I was in a meeting, 5 men. We had a significant challenge that we were trying to deal with. And as I was, as I said earlier, I learned to kind of listen a little bit and think, and then kind of not be the first to speak. So after sort of listening to all the different perspectives, I said, well, here's what I'm hearing you say. You sort of said this, this, and this. And I said to one of them, do you think you could move that timeline slightly this way? And he said, yes, absolutely can do that. I said, okay. So what I think we could do is take this 3-pronged approach. Prong 1 looks like this, prong 2 looks like this, prong 3 looks like this. Either way, we have a backup plan and they'll get to the final goal in time. And so it was then like the senior project manager, a man, said, you know what I think we should do? And literally repeated what I just said. And so what I did was I went, did you just repeat what I said? I said, thanks for reaffirming my idea. I really appreciate that. And then I said, so back to business. And then I just continued the conversation. So when I share that with women, when I do my women in leadership, they're like, you did that? I went, yeah. I could have been like, dude, or something. But instead I thought, I'm just going to own the space. I'm going to smile and take it right back from you. Thank you for reaffirming my brilliant ideas. I love it. And we're going to go back to what I was saying. Face changed again. I said, okay, so back to business. And then we went on and made the plan work. And I'll tell you, you never did that again. So I think it's important for women to realize you are in the driver's seat of these things. And it's just giving them the tools and teaching them on how to manage those conversations when these things happen, because we are often thrown off, right? I mean, I don't know what your experience is, but when that's happened to you, how have you dealt with it?
Well, it has happened to me. Like you said, you could write a book. It's happened to me many times. Yeah. I love your stories because they highlight the opportunity for stretch. You actually took it as an opportunity to embolden yourself. So in the first example where you said, okay, you took it as an opportunity to promote yourself, not only through your CV points, but through your composure, through your very presence. And that is a learning moment. It's it takes a bit of courage, but you also taught others when you did it. And
it was sort of my natural reaction, because I thought I'm not going to lower the bar for myself. I'm raising the bar for myself.
You raised
and as a leader, and as a leader, I mean, I was one of the most senior people on campus. I was not going to kind of bring myself down to that level. I thought, okay, I'm going to take the higher road on this, and this is how I'm going to manage it.
And so, and my examples are a little bit different, but the ones that are the most memorable for me, where you really feel that raw emotion, and it stays with you for decades.
It sure does.
So one early job I had, a manager tell me, I was getting ready to do this presentation, which it was my job to do this presentation at a conference, and I was excited about it. And he tells me, well, I'm not sure you can do it. And this, he says, you're petite, you're female, and you're soft spoken.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, those were the reasons I couldn't do it. Not because
And so what happened?
smart.
Yeah. So what happened? Did you do it?
Not only did I do it, I knocked it out of the park. I mean, beyond any expectations, for real. And I'm not naturally braggy, okay? But I also want to say, in his defense, we're all a product of our culture, and he believed what he said, but he stepped up and he mentored me. And so I feel like I learned so much from him that you could go to Toastmasters for a year, and I'm a big believer in Toastmasters. I learned more from him in the coaching coming up to that conference. So he did good.
Yeah.
First he belittled through his comment, but then he did good.
What's interesting about your story is I feel like so this is another thing that I think is really important for women and even small business owners. There are going to be moments in your career that are going to define you.
Yeah.
And that story you just shared, it could have totally pulled out your confidence and you could have tanked. Instead, what he did was he just lit a fire, right? And you were like, I'm not going down like the way I'm going to show you what I can do. And those are my favorite kind of women, to be honest. So it's interesting because, I remember doing a women's program when I was at U of T, and it was for young women, like just recent graduates, just about to graduate. And there was a young woman around the table that talked about an interview she did with a very big communications company in Canada. Okay. And the director that was interviewing her for this job she desperately wanted, partway through the interview, says to her, so, tell me what you think your biggest strength and skill is. And she said, oh, I think it's communications. I think I'm a very good communicator. He goes, yeah, I don't see that. And then the interview she told us all, the interview just went downhill. So what was interesting about that is she was a student leader. So you imagine if you're a student leader, she's done speeches, she's spoken in public. So she felt very strongly that her communication skills were good. So as we were sort of debriefing about that after she shared that story, her peers were saying, oh, you're good. And so I remember just sort of listening to them all and saying, he did you the biggest favor. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, so first of all, I'm glad you didn't get the job. She goes, no, but I really, really wanted it. I said, no, you didn't. If you think you did, but someone like that would have diminished your confidence and your sense of self so early in your life and career that he would have probably flatlined it for you without you even realizing it. So you do not want to work with someone like that. You want to work with someone who's going to see the potential in you. They might kind of like in the middle of an interview. So I said to her, she's, well, I don't know how I would have responded. And I said, well, my response would have been, it's such an interesting insight in such a short amount of time. I really would love to learn more in terms of why you feel this way. Please I'd share more. I'd like some feedback and insight because I believe feedback is a gift. And she was like, I would like, you're not going to get the interview anyway, but I'm going to call you out on it. I'm sorry. But I would very much like to know why you think somebody in 10 minutes is a terrible communicator when I'd seen this young woman in action. I mean, I would never have described her that way. But I also feel like if I'm not going to get the job, I'm just going to done that before, by the way. I was going to say, I remember being interviewed for a job once and the person said, yeah, I'm just not sure you could do it. I went, that's a really interesting insight. Can you tell me more? Well, I threw them off. And then, of course, they were like, well, I don't know if you could do this. I don't know if you could do that. I said, so are you aware that in my current job, this is what I do? And so I connected the dots and they were like, huh, I had no idea. So, yeah, most people don't. So guess what? I got the job. I did get the job. But, not everyone's going to have the chutzpah to do that.
Well, and that's actually what I'm taking from this. So it's interesting how you mirrored back on me at the fire, which I didn't see in my own story, but you were right, Georgette. And what I'm seeing in your story is the confidence that comes from your presence.
Yeah, so I always said I've been very blessed. I don't know whether it was just growing up in a place where you didn't fit in and I decided long ago, because I just wasn't like everybody else. I always say I'm like the Kramer. I used to love Kramer on Seinfeld. But I kind of marched to my own little drum in many ways. So it didn't matter to me. I thought, I know who I am. I know the parts that I like, and I know the parts I need to work on. So, but with that, part of it comes in with, if you know who you are at the end of the day in here, nothing can shake that. And so I also know where my boundaries are and what my limitations are. So I remember, years ago, in 2010, I was applying for a job, and like 6 interviews, 10 reference checks. I said to people, I'm running out of friends here. And one of the final interviews was a very senior person. And I remember saying to him, I will always tell you what I think. It's going to be in your best interest and the best interest of the organization. If you are comfortable with that, I'm your girl. But if not, you should probably go on to the next candidate. And I remember telling my husband, he went, are you insane? You're going to lose the job. And I went, it's okay. Then I don't want to work with him. If his attitude is, I don't want someone who is going to actually care about the organization and me and what we do, then a problem and expect me to go, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. That's not who I am. So it's not going to work anyway. I will be miserable. And so to his credit, he hired me. We had like the best run ever. But part of it was just figuring out how to provide the feedback in a way that was going to be acceptable to him. So it wasn't like, no, I don't agree with you. That's stupid. It was never that. It was, have we thought about this? Have we thought about how this would lay out? What are some considerations? And again, sort of helping him feel like he was in the driver's seat. Well, in many ways, I was sort of helping drive the car, if you will.
Yeah, and I can see through that story that your confidence is rooted in an acceptance of yourself. So you said at the beginning of the story, I know myself, I know what where I need to grow and where I like where I'm at. And it's the acceptance of that allows for this confidence to emerge. You're not worried that somebody's going to see something that you're trying to hide.
No. And what's interesting is, when you and I talk about women and the challenges they face, I find often it's that part, it's the confidence. I was talking to somebody, I said, I hate the word imposter syndrome. I really think it needs to be, call it something else, because that tends to apply a lot to women and marginalized communities. And we don't think of white men having imposter syndrome. We tend to associate it with this other group of people. And for me, I'm not an imposter. I am who I am. I show up. And I would say most women do. They may not feel like they should be at the table. So that's hence the imposter piece. But the reality is that's an inclusion issue. That's not I don't qualify to be at the table issue in my mind. Most women, most people who, BIPOC, members of marginalized, they probably deserve to be where they, at the table. The reason they don't feel they need to be there is because they don't see other representation that looks like them or in the other, upper echelons of organizations. So it's really important for us to be thinking about, what does that mean? And for me, I think I've always been a little bit bold. So that's part of my personality to begin with. And, and I would say probably not dissimilar to you in many ways. Personalities are a little different, but I would say, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this is, when you're a business owner, if someone pushes you down, you kind of dust off and retool and pivot and start again. And so if you've got that kind of mindset, those things are not going to tear you down. They're just going to get you to rethink and pivot or maybe question and build and develop and grow. And that really comes from having a growth mindset in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it does. And, I've encountered similar things with clients that really kind of surprised me in the beginning. And then I started to see a pattern where this would come up with other people. And one example was women who run their own business, who are really smart and accomplished. And then they, in private conversations will say their mentor is leading them down a certain road and they're following, but they're not comfortable. And it's almost like they're asking me to give them permission to stop following that mentor.
Right. Right.
Because the mentor sees things through a very sort of conventional way. This is the way you need to build your practice. And it's not their way. It's not authentic to them. And it's time for them to say goodbye.
And so how do you coach them? So how do you coach them out of that? I'm curious.
We shift from the conversation about the mentor to talking about their own values. So just park that whole conversation about the mentor. Tell me about you. And about the things you're most proud about in your firm. What is your vision for the future? Talk about the culture, the values, the way you see yourself as a leader. And then it's like, it's so blatantly obvious that that vision they just told me about is completely different from what the
Yes.
mentor was saying. And I'm like, what do you think you should be doing?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But you know what you've done in that example you just gave me is you reminded them that they should be behind the wheel and
Yeah,
not in the passenger seat.
yeah,
And so sometimes what happens is we get these mentors or people we look up to, and you think, well, they've been really successful, but their story is not your story.
right.
Right? We are all going to have to write our own stories. So what happens is we think, well, because they know more, I should listen to them. But exactly what you said, like what worked for them, it may not work for you. And you know, and most of these entrepreneurs and business leaders have a good sense of what they want to do. It's just the fear, questioning their decisions, what's holding, and then the fear of failure, right? So you think, well, I'll just copy this person because I know they've done it well. But as you point out, so I love how you just talked about how you coached them through it, because then it's like hopefully a light bulb moment's happening and
Oh
they're going,
yeah, light bulb. And they
it's
don't,
like, move over, I'm driving this car.
and they don't go back. Like once they make that decision, they fly forward.
Yeah, yeah. And I
It's
can see that.
really
But you know
cool.
what you've done is you've empowered them. I
Yeah,
love that.
yeah,
You've
yeah.
empowered them to see who they actually are. And it's funny, as you were describing the questions you were asking, I was thinking, what you're really doing is getting people to understand who they are at the core.
Right.
And right through all the things that you talked about, really what you're doing is getting people to understand, well, who am I at the core? Because that's what's going to be my authentic self. Therefore, imposter stuff is here. It's going to be aligned with my values. And you're talking about the alignment. That's really important because you cannot succeed without alignment.
Well, and the trust in that authentic self. Because
Right.
in the examples that come to mind for me where this happened several times, the mentor was always, I hate to say it, but they were a man, in a man's world. And so these were women and they didn't feel like that. They
Yeah.
didn't feel that confident in themselves as a niche. So they felt like they had to follow what that mentor said because that's the only way. That's the only way. And another example that was sort of related to that, where I was helping somebody who was coaching somebody who was so smart and innovative and doing things her own way. And in a private conversation, I could see the barriers around her leadership, like she was just at the wall. And, I would ask her questions about why she couldn't see herself going past that point. And really, what came out of it was she didn't see leaders that resembled her.
Right. Yeah. 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 And so, what's interesting about what you just said for me is, I've talked about people being trailblazers. And so, her mindset is not, I'm a trailblazer.
Yeah,
Because if it was, she'd realize there is nobody like me, but that's okay. I'm going to pay
exactly.
for the next group of people so I can be the role model people follow. But
Yes,
some people are maybe not comfortable doing that yet. And, so if I waited for people to look like me in different jobs and different roles, I'd be like, I would never get to where I got. I mean, I was often the only person
yeah.
in a room. I've traveled around the world in various roles and, again, often the only woman and only curly haired lady with a big smile. But what was interesting about that is I owned that space. Like I learned to walk into the room and make sure people didn't think I was here to take notes. I'm going to be part of the conversation, and so it's also I think training people to think about when you communicate, how are you communicating? What does that presence actually look like? We talked about presence earlier, but it's not just sort of the sense of self and confidence. It's also how are you communicating? Verbal, physical, all of those cues are giving people a sense of who you are, and that actually shapes how people are actually responding back to you in that regard, right? And so, when I look at people and think, well, there isn't someone, I'm thinking, well, that's why the book's called Why Not You, right? It's like,
Right.
people think, I can't do that. I'm like, why not? And they're like, they give me all the reasons why they can. I'm like, let me give you all the reasons why I think you can, right?
Yeah.
So I love the fact that you were talking about, there's a wall, but then how do you help them break down that wall to see that they absolutely can and get over that hurdle? That's really brilliant.
Yeah. And sometimes one conversation is all it takes for them to see that possibility,
Yeah.
especially with somebody who is doing things a little differently themselves. So trailblazer to trailblazer.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great story. That's wonderful. I love it.
So Georgette, this is maybe a good place for us to say thank you. Any final thoughts would you like to share?
Well, so we talked about being in the driver's seat and the empowerment piece, but I also strongly believe, and I know I talk about this often in what I call the power of one and the power of us. So, when we think about I can't and I shouldn't and I like, trailblazing, if we think back about the lives that we've touched, whether we realize it or not, or the impact you made on people. So I think about the work that you do and the aha moments people have. So I want you to think about if you've coached somebody and they've flourished. Think about the impact on that person, not just on their business, but how that person is going to lead differently and impact all the people that they interact with, and the ripple effect of that work that you're doing that's so meaningful. And so when I talk about the power of one, I think about, and the power of us, I think about, well, imagine the impact that we all make daily if we tried and took on a growth mindset, a positive mindset, and think about every single day as you're leaving a legacy behind of making a significant difference in somebody else's life. And to me, that's like the best that there could be.
That's beautiful. It's a way of giving yourself fuel for everything that you do because you feel purposeful.
Yeah. Well, it starts with purpose, right? I mean, if you don't have purpose, then why are you getting up and doing things every day? And, I've always joked around to people say, oh, you seem so happy. And I'm like, well, let's see. I get up in the morning and I think, thank you, God, for having a roof over my head, family that's healthy, food on the table, the lights are on. Everything else is gravy. Everything else is like a bonus. So for me, those are things that are important. Starting with gratitude is important. Purpose is important. Right?
That's
And
beautiful.
having intention every single day in everything we do.
Yeah. You know what? It's really funny that you brought this up because it's been coming up recently quite often in coaching meetings that people are talking about their inner critic and how it's tying them up in knots and they're feeling their energy is zapped. And, we've talked about different ways to balance that out with the the inner wisdom, right?
Yes.
And part of fueling or strengthening the inner wisdom is through gratitude practices, like you just brought up.
Yeah. And, when I do training, and, again, and I do a lot with other groups, but when we talk about the inner critic piece, there's a great video I use that talks about Albert Einstein and Maya Angelou, who were always sort of thinking like they were imposters on some level. But what's interesting about the inner critic piece is like we have this little acronym called, WAIT, so it's basically, the idea is to sort of say, is what am I thinking and saying to myself, is that really a reality check? So often, we think this way and then, but is that really the reality? So there's many ways to kind of break that down. I say to people, it's important to have what I call a board of advisors. So I have one. They don't necessarily know they're my board of advisors, and and what that means is when I'm not really sure about something, I will contact some of these folks, and they're my friends, but they're not like my BFFs, So the idea is to bounce ideas off of them. Well, they'll give me critical feedback in terms of, yeah, this is a good strategy or this isn't. And the reason I use that example is because I say, your friends are going to say, Sandra, of course you're going to be great. You're going to be fantastic. Why wouldn't you fail? That's what friends do. Your board of advisors would say, that's a great idea, initiative. Now walk me through some of the things. What are the ramifications for your business in 6 months or a year from now? Is this going to cut your career? Is it going to advance your career? And then you make decisions. So when you are doing that inner critic piece, it's important to have either a coach who's going to be more arm's length or, board of advisors or a combination to help you succeed, I think.
Mm-hmm. I feel like before we say, close up this podcast, I just want to raise one more topic. You and I had a conversation about how, and you just brought it up recently, how your body language or your voice is part of your actual voice, is part of the message that people get. And you threw an interesting statistic at me, message versus.
Oh, yes. Can
you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, it was Dr. Mehrabian. And so, I often, when I do training, I'll say to people, like, what do you think the body language, and people say, oh, when we think about making first impressions, and people will often think that, the way you look and you sound, it's like 60-40, 30, whatever. And it's literally, it's 7% of what you actually say. And then there's like 50 something percent that is on how you physically show up. And then the other is your voice, 30 something percent is your voice. And the reason there's that breakdown is that isn't to say that content doesn't trump everything else. Like what matters. But when you make a first impression, if you show up disheveled, if you show up like you just, you didn't make the effort to go into a meeting, that is how people are going to see you. So when we talk about presence, it matters. The other part is your voice. So am I murmuring? Am I talking like this? Or am I owning my space? Right? Am I pausing? Am I smiling? What is my body language saying? Am I talking to you, twitching my hair, or like, the Jimmy leg is, am I talking to you? Or am I, again, owning my space and my body language? And so as we do all of this, we train people on this to kind of minimize these things. You get presence, you get how people experience you. And this is really where it becomes more powerful. And you yourself start to feel more powerful as a leader. So originally, it's, when we think about, we view people and we make the assessment as soon as someone walks in, and you have to think, I'm going to put bias aside. But, that starts to move sideways when you start speaking and owning the space that you did. And it's interesting because you've used the word confident with me multiple times now in the last bit. And that's nice. I like to think of myself that way. I'm not sure I'm like every day that way, but I can dial it up. But the reality is, that's how, if you want to hire someone, don't you want to feel that you have confidence in the ability to represent your company, to own a room? If you're going to close the deal, that this is who you want in the room. And they're articulate, they don't get phased very easily. Presence, that's really important. And again, feeling like that person is going to be the driver's seat of your company, or you're in the driver's seat of your company, and taking it to where you want it to go.
You know what this brings to mind for me that has come up again with women who own their own, professional practice? It's come up several times where they have the message right. They have this big thing they need to say to their team or to a client, or go out on, on a stage and do a speaking seminar, and they know what to say. But when they start delivering it, they sound small. And the only thing that we work on, it's like the voice. So we do role play, and I tell them, don't use the guilty voice. Or, like, I'm asking my team to do something. I feel bad. I don't want to ask them to do too much. And, I'm worried they're not going to like it. And like, get rid of that guilty voice. Where's that coming from? And when they do it again with the understanding that everything they're talking about actually is helpful to their team or helpful to their audience, their voice completely changes.
So you just touched on what I call shared purpose. So rather than focusing on, I'm going to burden you with this extra thing, I'm going to remind us all that we have shared purpose. So the reason we're all showing up every day is we have this shared purpose of what the reason you're all here is we're moving this shared vision together, and we're all going to win, right? So it's a win-win for everyone. So the reason we need to all take on a little bit more is because we have shared purpose. And when we get there, we are going to celebrate, not I, right?
Right.
And so that actually changes the game and the narrative.
Yeah, and it changes the voice all by itself.
It does, absolutely
you need a voice coach. You just need a purpose coach.
But it goes back to what you were saying, I think even earlier. It's a little bit on the confidence piece, and it's a little bit about finding your voice. And yes. We want to be liked when we want to be liked. So I don't want to ask somebody for one more thing. I don't want them not to like me if I, so, and I what's interesting about that to me is, with all due respect, men don't think about that. I remember a really good friend of mine who's a partner at a law firm, and she said, a colleague, he was also a male partner, he had gone, she took over his work for the whatever weeks he was gone. So when he came back, she basically, and I think she was going, she asked if he could do the same. And he sort of sent this lovely email, but it was basically a no, thank you, I'm not going to do it for you email. But it was worded so beautifully that it was, I'm still catching up on my work, although I would very much like to support your. And she said to me, can you believe it? I went, oh, honey, you need to save that email. And she said, why? I said, because you're going to use it the next time on him. That's what you're going to do. She started laughing. And I said, you're going to take that email, because it was so beautifully written. It was almost not offensive, but it was that very, no way, and I'm going to do this for you. But it was not, no, it was no, beautifully written. So I said, you save that and you're going to use it. Because when he did it, you were like not offended, but like, I can't believe I did all his work for him. And when it was his turn, he's like, no. And I'm like, you're going to learn that. That is how you move up. It's like
So
setting
smart.
boundaries, but knowing how to say no politely in the most articulate ways. And say, she started, I remember us laughing about it. I said, save it because you're going to need it.
That was so smart, Georgette. You turned him into her teacher.
Well, but she never thought it. She's like, I'm like,
Yeah.
save it and use it because it worked. Because you were like, I don't know how to respond to that other than okay. And I'm like, very good. That's a good one in the file.
Right, exactly. Why isn't he a people pleaser like me? Right.
He doesn't have to be. He's very
Yeah.
good at what he does, and you're very good at what you do. So, setting boundaries is very important for people to be able to say no very politely. When people would ask me many from years, oh, we have a social committee, would like it. I'm like, those are not committees I wanted to be on as I began to kind of have a rise on senior leadership teams. I'm like, I don't want to be organizing an event. I would be happy to be on the strategic, fiscal, whatever committee because I knew financial acumen was going to be helpful to my career. I don't need to know how many cookies we're going to order. I'm good with that. Yeah, I'm sure there's a wonderful young man who'd be happy to do that for you. No problem.
Right. And bringing a pleasant demeanor to all of these things because you didn't do anything wrong and you're supporting people in a way that helps them, then you don't have that guilty voice. It's just not there.
No, I kind of, as I said, I think it's important to know where your boundaries are. Yeah. And if people ask you to be on something, you could say, thank you for thinking of me for this organization or this committee. I'm flattered. My plate is full right now, but can we revisit this in a year?
Beautiful.
And in a year, I'll figure out, in a year, I'm going to tell you what committee I want to be on.
Right. There you go. What a wonderful discussion, Georgette. We covered so many different aspects of women in leadership.
Yeah, thank you. It's always so great to talk to you, Sandra, and thank you for your openness. And I love all the things that you're doing in your podcast and the conversations that you're doing deep dives in. So thank you so much for thinking of me. I am so grateful to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Georgette, for your time and your insights. And to our listeners, if you are interested in learning more about Dr. Georgette Zinaty, please go to corporateclassinc.com and woowomen.com. That's spelled WHEW, women.com. You've been listening to Get in the Driver's Seat, stories about leadership moments in small to mid-sized professional practices. I'm your host, Sandra Beckor, practice management coach at Beckor Management. Take care, everybody.